This period is the first time in a long time that France has been humiliated on the global stage. Unfortunately, it happened to be during the tenure of French President Macron. The world knows and has seen how in the space of 4 years, France's influence in Africa has eroded, all thanks to the coups that occurred in some Sahel countries. France has lost, and instead of minding its business, President Macron is trying to change the narrative to save face. A few days ago, during a press conference, President Macron made a very contentious statement that has been making waves on the internet. His statement has even elicited a reaction from the authorities in Chad and Senegal, the latest African countries to kick out French military forces. But what did he say? Let's find out. On Monday, the 6th of January 2025, French President Macron made a ridiculous statement about the Sahel countries. In a meeting with French ambassadors at the annual Foreign Policy Conference for 2025, Macron said that he is still awaiting thanks from the Sahel states for Paris's efforts in preventing them from succumbing to militant control. He further added that France made the right decision to intervene in 2013 to combat Islamist militants, despite the fact that those countries have since distanced themselves from French military assistance. In his own words, "I think that they forgot to thank us, but that's okay, it will come in time." This right here is the words of a man who is pissed that some African countries would dare to humiliate France by kicking them out. But that's not all. Macron further added that none of them would have a sovereign state if the French army had not deployed in this region. We will come back to this statement. Finally, Macron said that France was not kicked out of the Sahel region. According to Macron, France simply decided to reorganize its African strategy. In his own words, no, France is not on the back foot in Africa. It is just lucid and reorganizing itself. Now let's analyze Macron's statement. First of all, Macron said that France made the right decision to intervene in 2013 to combat Islamist militants in the Sahel region, and that the Sahel countries ought to thank France for preventing them from succumbing to militant control. Frankly speaking, this has got to be the most ridiculous statement ever. Does the Sahel region look like it's free from insecurity caused by the Islamist militants? France spent 10 good years in the Sahel region, supposedly fighting the insecurity. Despite its large military forces and high-grade military equipment, the insecurity continued to increase with each passing year. To make matters worse, France was brought in when the insecurity first started. France was right there when the Islamists were just a few with local weapons. But under France's watch, the jihadists increased and spread all over the region, causing chaos and havoc. And as the insecurity spread, France continued to increase its military might in the region. Macron said France's intervention in the Sahel in 2013 was the right move. Yet France's intervention, known as Operation Barkhane, is universally regarded as a massive disaster on the part of the French. France does not want to admit it, but everyone knows, including France's allies. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, the worst part is that the current security crisis in the Sahel region, which started in Mali, was a spillover effect of NATO's intervention in Libya. NATO succeeded in taking out Gaddafi, destabilized Libya, and created an insecurity crisis that has killed millions of people. This just tells you that anywhere the West intervened militarily, whether in Africa or other regions, it usually left chaos and instability for the local population to deal with. So, Macron saying that France made a good decision in intervening in the Sahel region is ridiculous. When Operation Barkhane began, it was largely viewed as a success. France supposedly strengthened the Malian armed forces and employed their specialized air and ground technologies. But the only victory that the French army can boast of is during the first weeks of their arrival, when they battled the militants and recaptured the central northern cities of Timbuktu and Gao. Over the next 10 years, the only tangible thing we could see France doing was setting up different military bases all over the Sahel region. And, while France was busy setting up bases everywhere, the violence spread from Mali to Niger and Burkina Faso. Since 2017, the violence levels in the three countries have risen each year, reaching over 2,500 incidents in 2021 and nearly 6,000 deaths. The report is clear. The increase in regional instability in the Sahel was exacerbated by French presence in the region. So, saying that the Sahel should thank France for increasing the instability in the region is laughable and ridiculous. Now, the second ridiculous thing that Macron said was that without the French army, there would not have been a sovereign Sahel state. What a stupid statement. How does the presence of the French army in the Sahel correlate to the formation of Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and the rest of the Sahel countries as independent states? It seems Macron has forgotten that these countries fought for their independence. People gave their lives to see that these countries were standing on their own even though the independence was a sham. Macron only started talking about reducing French forces in the region when Mali kicked them out, and even that was just talk. Burkina Faso kicked them out and Niger did the same. Recently, Chad did the same, and Senegal also has plans to kick out French armies. The only country that France can boldly say it decided to leave is Ivory Coast. We all know that the president of Ivory Coast is a French puppet and would never dream of telling France to leave the country. This is why Macron had the boldness to say that some African countries did not want France to leave. He was actually referring to Ivory Coast. France decided to leave Ivory Coast so that it could create the narrative that it wasn't kicked out of any African countries, but decided to leave by itself. But the truth is, it doesn't even matter. Everyone followed the events that happened and knows that France was kicked out, just like Niger kicked out the US forces. The only person deceiving himself here is the French President Macron. It's pathetic, honestly. Now, in response to Macron's statement, the authorities in Chad and the Prime Minister of Senegal released statements that called out Macron's comments. Let's start with Chad. The press statement released by the Foreign Minister of Chad reads as follows. The government of the Republic of Chad expresses strong concern following the recent remarks made by the President of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, which reflect a contemptuous attitude towards Africa and Africans. Chad wants to recall that it has no problem with France as a nation, nor with the French people, with whom it shares a history marked by human and cultural relations. However, the French leaders must learn to respect the African people and recognize the value of their sacrifices. History attests that Africa, including Chad, played a decisive role in the liberation of France during the two world wars, a fact that France has never truly acknowledged. The immense sacrifices made by African soldiers to defend freedom have been minimized, and no worthy thanks has been expressed. As far as Chad is concerned, it is worth emphasizing that the construction of our army is not the work of France. Our army, strong and resilient, is the result of the bravery of the Chadian people and the sacrifices made in modest means. France has never endowed the Chadian army in a significant way, nor contributed to its structural development. In its 60 years of existence, marked by civil wars, rebellions, and prolonged political instability, French contribution has often been limited to its own strategic interests, with no real lasting impact on the development of the Chadian people. Instead of going after Africa, President Macron should focus his efforts on resolving the problems of the people of France. The Chadian people aspire for full and complete sovereignty, genuine independence, and the construction of a strong and autonomous state, acquired at the price of priceless sacrifices. We invite our partners, including France, to integrate this legitimate aspiration into their approach to relations with Africa. What a brilliant statement. France used a lot of African countries to fight its wars, but has never said thank you to Africa. Besides this, France has committed so many atrocities, such as the assassinations of African leaders who stood against France. But France has never officially tendered an apology. Yet France is waiting for thanks for a job that was never done. As the Chadian authorities said, instead of thinking about Africa, Macron should focus on solving the problems of the French people. Now, what about Senegal? Following Macron's statement on Monday, the Prime Minister of Senegal, Ousmane Sonko, stated, President Emmanuel Macron stated today that the announced departure of the French bases would have been negotiated between the African countries that decreed it and France. Macron also said that it was out of simple convenience and politeness that France granted the first announcement to these African countries. What a lie. It was very obvious that all the announcements came as a shock, especially that of Chad, but Macron can keep on believing whatever he wants. The Prime Minister further added that, I would like to say that, in the case of Senegal, This statement is totally erroneous. No discussion or negotiation has taken place to date, and the decision taken by Senegal stems from its sole will as a free, independent, and sovereign country. This is true, and it is also true for Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. As we said, the only country that this is not true for is Ivory Coast. Now here is something interesting. Macron said that France was not kicked out of Africa, but decided to withdraw by itself. If this is true, why then did he say that anti-French sentiments began to spread across the Sahel because Russia published false information about France to turn the minds of Africans against France? Why did he express anger at the fact that the Sahel countries opened their arms wide to receive Russia in place of France? You see, when President Macron came into power, he saw himself as a man on a mission to restore France's greatness and lead the rest of Europe. And, as you know, the only way to achieve this has to be to maintain its hold on its former African colonies. After all, these colonies were the sole factor that pushed France to attain its global power status. This was why when President Macron first came to power in 2017, one of the first things he did was to give a speech saying that France no longer has an African policy, all in a ploy to make Francophone Africa believe that France had changed. From 2017, the president supposedly tried to change France's policy towards Africa, but obviously, all his efforts failed because, by 2020, anti-French sentiments had begun to spread, and the first coup occurred in Mali, which eventually led to French forces being kicked out of the country. Then came 2022, when yet another coup occurred in Burkina Faso, which brought Captain Traoré to power and led to French forces leaving the country. It was at this point that President Macron began to understand that his so-called different policy in Africa had failed. So, in February 2023, he went on a tour to 4 African countries where he outlined a new strategy for Africa. During the tour, he said that France's attitude towards Africa should be marked not by military presence, but by humility. And so, in the coming months, there will be a reduction of its military presence in Africa. However, this tour and his speech were not enough to stop the coup which occurred in Niger and again led to French forces leaving the country. The coup in Niger was a very big blow to France and President Emmanuel Macron because it left only Chad as the country in the Sahel where France still has some kind of influence. But as you know, Chad has followed the footsteps of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, ending military relations with France. The loss of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is perceived by the French establishment as a grievous loss in presumed global power, and it's particularly aggravating for President Macron because it was in his time that France lost hold of its former colonies. It's also particularly embarrassing for him because Macron from the beginning projected himself as a French leader who is different from his predecessors and wants to approach the French-Africa relationship differently. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because the fact is, he still had the same superior attitude as his predecessors towards Francophone Africa, and because Africans had had enough, France was kicked out. So, do you think France has learned from its mistakes? The answer is no. President Macron doesn't believe that Africa decided to kick them out because people were tired of France's neo-colonialism. Instead, he believes that the only reason they were kicked out is because Russia instigated it, meaning Russia is to blame. In a speech, President Macron stated that anti-French sentiments began to spread across the Sahel because Russia published false information about France to turn the minds of Africans against France. But what exactly is the false information he is talking about? Is it the fact that French companies have been exploiting Francophone Africa for years? Or the fact that the French military has not done anything to stop insecurity in the Sahel? President Macron also went on to say that the Russian mercenary group Wagner was behind the coups that took place in the Sahel. Can you imagine that? President Macron even had the guts to say that some African countries still exist because the French military was in their country. How does that even make any sense when the record clearly shows that the insecurity in the Sahel increased after the French military came into the picture? Clearly, France has refused to learn, and that's the reason why African nations are embracing the vision of a multipolar world and mutual international cooperation as espoused by Russia, China, and other global South nations. A world that is no longer under the control of the West and its allies, and this fact is what has made France angry and jealous of Russia. To cover up this anger and jealousy, President Macron has decided to find a new purpose and mission as the defender of Europe and sympathizer with Africa. against alleged Russian aggression. Not only has he said that Russia is a destabilizing force in Africa and that its presence will sabotage democratic processes in Africa, but President Macron has also called on the West to deploy troops to Ukraine to fight against Russia in the Russian-Ukrainian war. According to him, if Russia wins this war in Ukraine, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. But the fact is, this doesn't have anything to do with Europe's credibility, but his own credibility. Since he has lost Africa, President Macron feels the only way to build France's credibility as a global power is to defeat Russia, and this is why he is calling for troops to be deployed to Ukraine. He even went on to say that European leaders should not act cowardly, and there are no limits to French support. However, it seems President Macron has forgotten that if NATO troops are deployed to Ukraine, it may lead to World War III because President Putin has made it known that Russia is ready for any intervention from the US. What a shame on the part of President Macron. He was kicked out of Africa and now he wants to start World War III. Thankfully, other European leaders are not as dumb as President Macron because they have distanced themselves from his statement. President Macron is pathetic. France has lost in Africa, but instead of learning from its mistakes, Macron has decided to play the blame game, seeing Russia as the culprit. However, the truth is, Russia doesn't have anything to do with the recent changes in Africa's geopolitics. In fact, it's been a long time coming. For decades, after handing over nominal independence to African nations, France continued to exploit Francophone Africa by controlling their currencies and having cheap access to their natural resources. For example, most of France's electricity is generated from uranium ore mined at a ridiculously cheap rate in Niger, a country where the majority of its people lack access to electricity. This system of neo-colonialism was sustained by France bribing local corrupt regimes to do its bidding, and in exchange provide continuous security guaranteed from French military bases. This is the reason why some African leaders such as Omar Bongo of Gabon and Paul Biya of Cameroon can stay as long as they like in power. France's system ensured that any African leader who resisted was either removed or assassinated. However, the era of France's dominance is over, and African countries are now discovering a new sense of independence and purpose, as well as solidarity to help each other fend off pressure from France to reinstate the status quo ante. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.